He came to the mountains to outrun memories that had the persistence of ghosts. Elias Thorne had once moved through a world of sharp, defined edges, of orders given and executed, of a brotherhood forged in the dust and thin air of faraway places. That world had fractured, leaving behind a silence more deafening than any explosion. So he had sought a different kind of silence, one that lived in the vast, breathing cathedral of the Idaho Panhandle, where the pines scraped against a limitless sky, and the only orders came from the changing of the seasons. He drove his old truck until the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel thinned to a two-track scar winding deep into the timberlands. He stopped where the path dissolved entirely, swallowed by huckleberry bushes and fallen logs. This was the end of the line, for the truck at least. For him, it was a beginning of sorts, an attempt to begin the long, slow work of forgetting, or at least of learning to carry the weight of what he could not forget. He swung his legs out of the cab, the worn leather of his boots settling into the soft duff of the forest floor with a familiar sigh. He was a tall man, built with the lean, functional strength of someone whose body had been a tool for most of his life. In his early 40s, his face was a map of hard miles and sleepless nights, etched around eyes the color of a winter lake. He wore what had become his uniform in this new life, a faded olive M65 field jacket over a dark plaid flannel shirt, canvas cargo pants, and the same pair of boots that had carried him across 3 continents. On his wrist, the heavy, unadorned face of a military-issue watch ticked off a time that felt disconnected from the ancient rhythm of the mountains. From the passenger seat, a pair of intelligent amber eyes watched his every move. Cairo, his partner, shifted his weight, the sound of his claws a soft scratch against the worn seat cover. The German Shepherd was old, a veteran in his own right. The proud black saddle of his back was still sleek, but the fur around his noble muzzle had turned a distinguished, telling gray. He was not a pet. He had never been a pet. He was, and always had been, a professional. He sat with a disciplined stillness, assessing the new environment, his breathing steady and measured. He was never entirely off duty. Elias reached back into the truck and pulled out his pack, an Eberly stock half-track, its myriad straps and pockets holding the spare necessities of his self-imposed exile. He swung it onto his back, the weight a familiar comfort. He looked at Cairo. No words were needed. A slight nod was all it took. The dog hopped down from the truck, landing with a grace that belied his age. He stood beside Elias, his body a taut line of potential energy, his gaze sweeping the tree line. He was scanning for threats, for anomalies, for anything that broke the pattern of the wild. Their camp was a Spartan affair a mile further in, tucked into a small meadow sheltered by a crescent of granite. A simple canvas tent, a fire ring of blackened stones, and 2 lives stripped down to their essential elements. For weeks they had settled into a routine. They rose with the first hint of gray light in the east, the air crisp and smelling of pine and damp earth. They walked the ridges and valleys, not with any destination in mind, but simply for the act of moving, of putting one foot in front of the other. Elias found a strange solace in the physical exertion, in the burning of his lungs and the ache in his legs. It was a clean pain, a simple pain, one he could understand. The afternoons were for quiet. Elias would sit by the fire, sharpening his folding knife or cleaning the simple mechanics of his gear, his hands moving with an ingrained economy of motion. Cairo would lie nearby, not sleeping, but in a state of watchful repose, his ears swiveling to track the distant call of a raven or the rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. They were 2 solitary beings, sharing a silence that was comfortable, understood. The dog never demanded affection, and the man had little to give. What they had was deeper, a shared history, a bond of mutual respect forged in places where a single mistake was the only one you ever got to make. Elias often found himself watching the dog. He saw the way Cairo would test the wind, his nostrils flaring, deciphering a language of scent that was lost to him. He saw the quiet intelligence in the dog's eyes, a depth of understanding that sometimes felt more human than his own. In Cairo's calm, disciplined presence, Elias found a mirror of the man he used to be, the man he was still trying to find again. The dog was a living anchor to a past that was both his burden and his bedrock. But on this day, the rhythm was broken. They were walking a high ridge that overlooked a deep, bowl-shaped valley carved by some long-dead glacier. The air was still, held in the cupped hands of the mountains. The sun was warm on his face, and for a moment, a rare, fragile sense of peace settled over Elias. He stopped, pulling a dented metal canteen from his pack. Cairo, who had been trotting a few paces ahead, stopped with him. But he didn't relax. He didn't look back at Elias. His body went rigid. His head was up, ears forward, his entire being focused on a point down the slope, perhaps half a mile away. A low, almost inaudible rumble started deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of profound unease. It was a sound Elias had not heard since their last tour together, a sound that meant something was fundamentally wrong. Elias lowered his canteen, his brief moment of peace evaporating like mist. He followed the dog's unwavering gaze. He saw nothing but a dense stand of old-growth fur and a jumble of granite scree at the base of a sheer rock face. There was no movement, no sound that didn't belong. The wind whispered through the pines, the sun shone, the mountain held its breath. "What is it, boy?" Elias murmured, his voice a low rasp. Cairo didn't move. His breathing was shallow, controlled. He was locked on. Elias trusted the dog's instincts more than he trusted his own eyes. His training had taught him that the most dangerous threats are the ones you can't see. Cairo's senses operated on a different frequency, picking up on the subtle dissonances in the world, the things that were out of place. And right now, every fiber of the dog's being was screaming that something down there, in that unremarkable patch of forest, was deeply, terribly wrong. The mountain's silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. It felt like it was holding a secret. Cairo broke his stillness. He didn't wait for a command. With a purpose that was absolute, he started down the steep, wooded slope, moving with a fluid certainty that pulled Elias along in his wake. He wasn't chasing a scent. He was being summoned by it. Elias followed, his hand resting on the handle of the knife clipped to his belt, his senses suddenly on high alert. The quiet day had ended. Something else had begun. The dog moved with the focus of a compass needle finding north, descending into the valley where an old secret lay waiting in the dark. The descent was steep and treacherous. Elias moved carefully, bracing himself against tree trunks, his boots dislodging small cascades of loose soil and rock. Cairo navigated the terrain with an effortless agility, his path direct and unwavering. He never looked back, confident that Elias was following. This was not a walk anymore. It was an operation. The muscle memory of 1,000 similar movements took over Elias, his mind clearing, his focus narrowing to the mission at hand. Though he had no idea what that mission was, all he knew was the dog's certainty. They reached the bottom of the valley, a place of deep shadows and ancient quiet. The air was cooler here, thick with the smell of moss and decay. Massive moss-covered boulders, remnants of some ancient rock slide, were scattered amongst the towering firs. Cairo led him directly to the base of a sheer granite cliff face, a wall of stone that rose hundreds of feet into the sky. It seemed impassable, a definitive end. But Cairo didn't stop. He went straight to a section of the cliff that was overgrown with a tangle of wild rhododendron and ferns. He pushed his way into the dense foliage and disappeared. Elias followed, pulling aside the thick, leathery leaves. Behind the curtain of green, the rock face was not as uniform as it had appeared from a distance.
There was a depression, an alcove, almost like a shallow cave, filled with a deep pile of fallen rock and debris that looked like it had been accumulating for a century. Cairo stood before this pile of rubble, his body still tense. He whined softly, a sound of anxious urgency. Then he began to dig. His powerful front paws sent stones and dirt flying, his actions frantic but precise. He was focused on one particular spot at the base of the pile. "Easy, boy, easy," Elias said, placing a hand on the dog's back. Cairo ignored him, his instinct to unearth whatever lay beneath overriding his training. Elias knelt, his eyes scanning the debris. It looked like a natural rock slide, but Cairo's insistence told him otherwise. He began to help, not with the dog's frantic energy, but with a methodical patience. He tossed aside the larger stones, his gloves protecting his hands from their sharp edges. He dug through the packed earth and smaller scree. After 10 minutes of steady work, his fingers brushed against something that was not rock. It was cold, metallic, and unnaturally straight. He cleared more dirt away. It was the edge of a flat iron band. He worked faster now, his curiosity piqued. He uncovered more of the band, and then the splintered, petrified wood it was bolted to. He pulled back, his mind processing what he was seeing. It was a door. A heavy, iron-bound wooden door set directly into the rock face. Buried. Hidden. He and Cairo worked for another hour, clearing the last of the debris. The full structure was revealed. It was an old mine entrance, its heavy timbers warped and grayed with age, but still incredibly solid. The door was immense, built to withstand immense pressure, or to keep something securely locked away. A thick, rusted iron bar was set across it, locked into heavy brackets bolted deep into the surrounding rock. But it was the object bolted to the center of the door that drew Elias's full attention. It was a rectangular metal sign, its surface coated with a century of grime and rust. He used the sleeve of his jacket to wipe it clean. Faint lettering was visible beneath the corrosion, but he couldn't read it. Someone, a long time ago, had taken a tool, a chisel perhaps, or the claw of a hammer, and had deliberately, violently, scratched out every single word. The gouges in the metal were deep, angry. This was different. A warning sign was one thing. A warning sign that had been intentionally obliterated was something else entirely. It wasn't just a notice, it was a redaction, a secret being actively kept. It spoke not of danger, but of deception. Why not just remove the sign? Why deface it? It was as if the person who did it wanted the sign to remain as a testament to its own silence, a monument to a buried truth. Elias stood up, stepping back to take in the scene. The hidden door, the immense lock, the desecrated warning. Cairo sat beside him, panting softly, his work done. He looked from the door to Elias, a clear and simple question in his eyes. The dog had found the anomaly. He had done his part. The next move belonged to the man. Section S. Section. Elias felt a familiar, unwelcome sensation stirring in his chest. It was the pull of responsibility, the instinct to investigate, to uncover, to know. It was the very thing he had come to these mountains to escape. He had wanted peace, simplicity, a life with no more questions that needed answering. But the scratched-out sign was a question that refused to be ignored. It was a loose thread, and his training, his very nature, compelled him to pull it. He ran a hand over his face,
the rasp of his stubble loud in the profound quiet of the valley. He could walk away. He could turn around, lead Cairo back up the ridge and pretend they had found nothing. He could go back to his simple camp, his simple routine. He could choose ignorance. But as he looked at the deep, violent scratches on the sign, he knew he couldn't. An act of such deliberate concealment was an act of aggression. It was a lie carved in metal, and lies were something Elias had grown to despise. He looked down at Cairo, who was watching him with that unnerving intelligence. The dog had not brought him here by accident. In some way Elias couldn't explain, he felt that the dog had brought him here for a reason. To bear witness. He owed it to the dog, and perhaps to himself, to see this through. The ghosts of his past were born from a choice he had made to walk away. He would not make that same choice again. The drive to the county seat, a small town named Clark's Fork, took over an hour. The old truck rumbled over the gravel roads, kicking up a plume of dust that hung in the still air behind them. Cairo sat in the passenger seat, his head held high, looking out the window as the dense forest gradually gave way to ranch lands and weathered farmhouses. Elias drove with a focused stillness, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his mind turning over the image of the scratched-out sign. Clark's Fork was a town that felt preserved in amber. The main street was lined with brick buildings from the turn of the last century, their facades bearing the faded names of businesses long since gone. It was a place held together by habit and history, a world away from the anonymous sprawl of the cities he had left behind. He parked the truck in front of a stately gray stone building with the words Kootenai County Courthouse carved above its heavy oak doors. He left Cairo in the truck with the windows cracked, knowing the dog would remain watchful and still. As he walked up the courthouse steps, he felt a strange sense of dislocation. He had spent years operating in the shadows, in places where information was currency and official buildings were either targets or obstacles. To walk into one now as a civilian, seeking public records, felt unnatural. The county clerk's office was on the first floor, a large, high-ceilinged room that smelled of old paper, floor wax, and brewed coffee. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A long, polished wooden counter separated the public from the rows upon rows of massive, leather-bound ledgers and metal filing cabinets that lined the walls. Behind the counter, a woman sat at a large desk, her head bent over a document. She looked up as he approached, her eyes sharp and discerning. She was in her late 50s, tall and spare, with her graying hair pulled back in a neat, no-nonsense bun. Her face was lined with the quiet authority of someone who knew the intricacies of her domain. This was a woman who understood that the history of a place wasn't just in its stories, but in its deeds, its surveys, and its tax records. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. It wasn't unfriendly, but it held no artificial warmth. "I hope so," Elias said, his own voice feeling rusty from disuse. "My name is Elias Thorne. I'm looking for old survey maps of the region, specifically the area north of the Priest River, up in the Selkirk Range." The woman, whose nameplate read Margaret Finch, County Clerk, studied him for a long moment. She took in his field jacket, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the way he stood with a stillness that was not entirely relaxed. He did not look like the usual retirees or amateur genealogists who frequented her office. "That's a wide area," she said. "Are you looking for a specific parcel? A claim?" "A mine," Elias replied. "An old one. I don't have a name for it." Margaret Finch raised an eyebrow. "Most of those old silver and lead mines have been played out for 80 years. What's your interest?" Elias hesitated. He couldn't very well explain that his dog had led him to a secret door in the mountains. "I'm a geologist," he lied, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. A hobbyist. I'm interested in the historical formations of the area. The lie was thin, and he knew she could see through it. But she didn't call him on it. Instead, she gave a slow nod, as if accepting the premise for the sake of moving forward. She stood and walked over to a large, flat file cabinet in the corner of the room. Mines from that era would be on the original survey plats from the 1920s and 30s, she said, her back to him as she pulled open a wide, shallow drawer. It was a messy time. Lots of claims filed, abandoned, sold for back taxes. The paperwork is a nightmare. She pulled out a massive, rolled-up sheet of linen paper, yellowed with age, and carried it over to a large table. She carefully unrolled it, placing glass paperweights on its corners to hold it flat. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn map of a section of the county, rendered in faded ink, with elegant calligraphy and detailed topographical lines. Elias leaned over the map. He used his knowledge of the terrain he and Cairo had covered to pinpoint their location. He traced a line with his finger up a river, along a ridge, and down into the valley. Here, he said, his finger resting on a small, hand-drawn square. Right at the base of this cliff face. Margaret Finch leaned in, adjusting her reading glasses. She peered at the tiny symbol. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. "There it is. The widow's tier claim." She tapped a small notation next to the square. "Filed in 1928 by the North Idaho Mining Syndicate. Looks like they went bust." She ran her finger along a line of faded script. "The claim was forfeit to the county in 1934 for non-payment of taxes. There's a formal condemnation order filed with it." She walked back to a different cabinet and, after a moment of searching, pulled out a thin file folder. She opened it on the table next to the map. It contained a single, typewritten document. "Here it is," she said. "Condemnation Order 734, dated October 1934. It declares the Widow's Tier mine geologically unstable and a hazard to public safety. Standard procedure for an abandoned shaft. The entrance was to be sealed and marked." "Marked how?" Elias asked, his focus sharpening. "With a standard warning sign," she replied, looking at the document. "It's all boilerplate. Danger, unstable mine shaft, do not enter. Nothing unusual." Nothing unusual, except that someone had tried to erase that warning. "Is there anything else?" Elias asked. "Accident reports? Production logs?" Margaret shook her head. "If there were, they'd be in this file. It's empty. The company dissolved. The records are probably lost to time." She looked at him, her curiosity finally winning out over her professional reserve. "Why the interest in this particular hole in the ground, Mr. Thorne?" Elias met her gaze. He made a decision. He wasn't a geologist, but he wasn't a liar by nature either. "The warning sign," he said simply. "It's still there, but the words have been scratched out. Deliberately." A flicker of something, intrigue, concern, crossed Margaret's face. She looked from Elias to the old map, then back again. The careful archivist in her was stirred by the anomaly. A record had been tampered with. Not on paper, but in the world itself. She was silent for a full minute, her fingers tapping lightly on the old condemnation order. "My brother might know something," she said finally, her tone shifting from official to conspiratorial. "Alistair, he's a retired geologist from the State Survey, knows more about the rocks and history of this county than any man alive. He's forgotten more about old mines than most people ever learn." She scribbled an address on a small notepad. "He lives out on the lake. He loves a good mystery, especially one that's 80 years old. Tell him I sent you, and tell him about the sign." Alistair Finch lived in a small, cedar-shingled house perched on the shore of Lake Pend Oreille. The entire front of the house was a wall of windows, and the inside was a chaotic museum of a life spent studying the Earth. Bookshelves overflowed with geology texts. Tables were covered in rock samples and topographical maps, and the walls were adorned with framed geological surveys. Alistair himself was a man who seemed to be made of the same stuff as the mountains he studied. He was in his early 70s, with a shock of white hair, a face as weathered as a granite outcrop, and eyes that lit up with a fierce intelligence when his sister's name was mentioned. He greeted Elias at the door and, upon hearing the story, ushered him inside with an eager excitement. "The widow's tear," he exclaimed, pouring them both mugs of strong, black coffee. "Maggie sent you on a fine chase. I haven't heard that name in 30 years. He led Elias to a massive table dominated by a relief map of the entire region. "I remember the stories my grandfather used to tell. He was a logger back then. He said the widow's tear was supposed to be the biggest silver strike in North Idaho. The North Idaho Mining Syndicate came in with a lot of money and big promises. They hired half the men in the county." "What happened?" Elias asked. "That's the mystery," Alistair said, his finger tracing the ridges on the map. "They worked it hard for about 2 years. Then, almost overnight, they shut it down, packed up and vanished. The official story was that the vein pinched out. They hit granite and went bust. But the old-timers always said something else was going on." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "There were rumors, dark ones. Rumors of sickness among the miners, of the water in the creeks downstream turning foul. The local tribe, the Kootenai, they always said that mountain was sacred, a place to be left alone. They claimed the company had disturbed something it shouldn't have, woken up some poison in the rock." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. A poison in the rock. "And the sign?" Elias prompted. "The warning being scratched out?" Alistair shook his head, his expression grim. "That's the part that gives me a chill. A condemnation sign is for public safety. Destroying it, that's not just vandalism. That's malice. That's someone trying to erase the very idea of a warning. They want people to think it's just an old, forgotten hole in the ground. They don't want anyone asking why it was condemned in the first place." He looked Elias straight in the eye. "If you're telling me the truth, son, then that mine isn't just unstable. It's dangerous, and not because the roof might fall in." Elias returned to the mountain as dusk was settling, the sky turning a bruised purple and orange. The information from Margaret and Alistair had transformed the mystery from a simple curiosity into something far more ominous. He now had a name, a history, and a context for the malice he had seen carved into the metal sign. He couldn't leave it alone. He had to get inside. He approached the buried door not as a hiker, but as an operator. He had spent a career learning how to open things that were meant to stay closed. He examined the heavy iron bar that sealed the entrance. The lock was a massive, primitive thing, a simple but formidable pin and tumbler mechanism seized with a century of rust. Brute force would be loud and might damage the door. He needed to be smarter. He worked by the light of a headlamp, Cairo sitting patiently a few feet away, a silent, watchful guardian. From his pack, Elias retrieved a small tool roll. He selected a set of tension wrenches and a long, slender pick. It was delicate work. The rust fought him every step of the way. The metal groaned in protest. For over an hour he worked, feeling for the subtle shifts in the mechanism, listening to the faint clicks as the pins reluctantly aligned. It was a conversation between his hands and the old, stubborn lock. Finally, with a deep, grating screech of tortured metal, the lock's internal bar slid back. It was open. He carefully removed the heavy crossbar and leaned it against the rock wall. Now, only the door itself remained. He put his shoulder to it and pushed. It didn't budge. He found a small gap at the bottom, and using a small crowbar from his pack, he began to lever it open. The wood groaned, the iron hinges screamed, but slowly, inch by painful inch, the door moved. He opened it just enough to slip through. A wave of cold, stale air washed over him, a smell of absolute stillness, of dust, and of something else. A faint metallic tang that coated the back of his throat. He shone his headlamp into the darkness. A mine shaft stretched out before him, its walls shored up with massive, sweating timbers. A set of narrow-gauge rails disappeared into the oppressive black. "Stay," he commanded Cairo, his voice low. The dog whined, not wanting to be left, but he obeyed, sitting at the threshold.
This was a place for one man to enter first. Elias stepped inside, his boots crunching on the gravel floor. The silence was absolute, a physical pressure on his eardrums. His headlamp beam cut a sharp, lonely cone through the darkness. He saw old pickaxes and shovels leaning against the wall, coated in a thick blanket of dust, as if their owners had simply set them down and walked away. A line of ore carts sat on a siding, empty. He followed the tracks deeper into the mountain. The air grew colder, the metallic smell stronger. The shaft was unnervingly well preserved. There were no major cave-ins, no signs of the instability mentioned in the condemnation order. That was another lie. After about 200 yards, the main shaft opened into a larger chamber. Here there had been a workspace. A wooden table and benches stood in the center, and shelves carved into the rock held lanterns and boxes of blasting caps.
But what drew his eye was another, smaller tunnel branching off to the side. Unlike the main shaft, this one was deliberately sealed with a wall of carefully laid bricks and mortar. It was newer than the surrounding work, but still decades old. There was no door this time, just a wall. But in the center of the wall, at shoulder height, was a small sealed iron hatch, like the door to a furnace. This was it. This was the heart of the secret. He used the crowbar again, forcing it into the seam of the hatch. It was sealed tight. He put his weight into it, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining. With a sudden explosive crack, the seal broke. He pried the small iron door open. Inside was not a continuation of the tunnel, but a small, dry, brick-lined vault. And inside the vault sat 3 military-style metal footlockers, their olive-drab paint covered in a fine layer of dust. They were completely out of place, from a different era than the rest of the mine.
His heart hammered in his chest. He reached in and pulled one of the footlockers out. It was heavy. He laid it on the floor of the chamber and unlatched the 2 clasps on the front. They opened with a crisp, clean snap. He lifted the lid. It was not filled with silver ore. It was filled with paper. Stacks of leather-bound surveyor's logs, bundles of documents tied with string, and a collection of glass vials containing murky water samples. At the very top lay a thick, leather-bound journal. He picked up the journal. The leather was supple, well cared for. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, the ink faded but perfectly legible. September 12th, 1933. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. I am the chief geologist for the North Idaho Mining Syndicate. I am sealing this record here in the vain hope that truth, like water, will eventually find its way to the light. I fear it is the last thing I will ever write. Elias stared at the name, his breath catching in his throat. Thorne. It was his grandfather's name. A man he had never met. A man his own father had never spoken of. A man who had simply vanished from their family history, presumed to have abandoned his wife and child during the Depression. He hadn't abandoned them. He had been silenced. With trembling hands, Elias began to read.
The journal told a chilling story. His grandfather had not discovered a silver vein that pinched out. He had discovered that the silver was intrinsically bonded with a rare, undocumented, and lethally toxic heavy metal. The dust from the mine, the runoff into the water table. It was a slow-acting poison. He had documented the rising sickness among the miners, the contamination of the watershed. He had presented his findings to the syndicate's board of directors. They had ordered him to falsify his reports. The mine was too profitable, their investment too great. When he refused, they had fired him, threatened him, and seized his research.
He knew they would not let the truth come out. So he had hidden his true findings, the logs, the water samples, his journal, in this secret vault he had built, a time capsule of their crimes. The last entry was a hurried scrawl. October 4th, 1933. They are coming for me. I know too much. They will bury this mine, but they will not say why. They will lie. They will say it is unstable. Someone must know the truth. The water is the legacy. The water carries the poison. Forgive me, Eleanor. Forgive me, my son. Elias closed the journal, his knuckles white. This was the secret. Not a failed silver mine, but a successful cover-up. An act of corporate murder that had been poisoning this land for 80 years. The scratched-out sign wasn't just to hide a secret. It was to perpetuate a crime. And it was a crime committed against his own family. He carefully placed the journal back in the footlocker and latched the lid. He felt the weight of it in his hands. Not just the physical weight of the metal and paper, but the crushing weight of 80 years of silence. He had come to these mountains to escape his own ghosts, and instead, he had found his grandfather's. He picked up the footlocker. He had what he needed. He turned and started back down the long, dark tunnel, his headlamp beam cutting a path toward the faint rectangle of twilight that was the entrance. He stepped out of the mine, blinking in the fading light, the cold, fresh air a stark contrast to the tomb he had just left. And he found he was no longer alone. A man was standing there, not 20 feet away. He was in his late 40s, dressed in expensive, practical outdoor wear that looked like it had been purchased last week. A crisp, gray technical jacket, dark trousers, and polished hiking boots. He was flanked by two other men, bigger and dressed in the simple, functional jackets of a work crew.
The man in the middle was smiling, a polite, confident smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the discovery you've made," the man said, his voice smooth and reasonable. Cairo, who had been waiting patiently, rose to his feet, a low growl vibrating in his chest. He moved to stand between Elias and the newcomers, his body a rigid line of defiance. "My name is Caldwell," the man continued, ignoring the dog for the moment. "I'm the project manager for Apex Minerals. I'm afraid you're trespassing on private property." Elias said nothing. He held the footlocker, its handle cold in his grip. His gaze flickered between Caldwell and his two men. They were trying to be casual, but their hands were empty and their stances were ready. They were professionals of a different sort. "We've recently acquired the mineral and reclamation rights to this entire parcel," Caldwell went on, his tone that of a patient teacher explaining something to a slow student. "Our geological teams flagged this site for environmental remediation, a legacy issue from an old operation. We were scheduled to begin work tomorrow, sealing it permanently." He gestured toward the mine entrance. "You've saved us a bit of trouble, finding the entrance for us." His eyes fell to the footlocker in Elias's hand. "That looks like it might be a historical artifact. Company policy dictates that all such materials found on our sites be turned over to our legal department for proper archival." He held out a hand. "I can take that off your hands for you. In fact, Apex would be willing to offer a generous finder's fee for your amateur archaeology, a token of our appreciation for your help." The words were slick, coded in corporate jargon designed to minimize and control. remediation, legacy issue, historical artifact. He was trying to frame the crime as an administrative task. Elias shifted his grip on the footlocker. He thought of his grandfather's last, desperate words. He thought of the 80 years of poison seeping into the earth. He looked at Caldwell's clean, manicured hands and his polite, empty smile. "No," Elias said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silence of the valley with the force of a stone. Caldwell's smile tightened at the edges. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. You have to understand this is a sensitive area. There are legal protocols. What you have there is corporate property. Your continued presence here and your refusal to cooperate could have unfortunate legal consequences." The veiled threat hung in the air, as toxic as the metallic tang from the mine. Elias didn't reply with words. He simply stood his ground, a silent, immovable object. His entire life had been a process of being honed into a weapon, a tool for applying force. But he had also learned that sometimes the greatest strength was simply to endure, to stand fast. Caldwell let out a sigh, a theatrical display of disappointment. "I was hoping we could be reasonable." He glanced at his two men, a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. They began to spread out, their movements slow and deliberate, trying to flank him. It was then that Cairo acted. He had been a statue of coiled tension, the low rumble in his chest the only sign of the storm within. Now, without a sound, he took 2 steps forward. He lowered his head, and for the first time, he bared his teeth. The gesture was not wild or frantic. It was a cold, precise, and utterly terrifying display of weaponry. The growl that followed was no longer a warning. It was a statement of intent. It was a promise of swift and devastating violence. It was the sound of a creature who understood combat better than the men standing before him. Caldwell and his men froze. Their professional composure evaporated.
They were not looking at a dog anymore. They were looking at a weapon system, and they understood, in that primal, instinctual way, that it was aimed directly at them. Caldwell's eyes for the first time showed a flicker of genuine fear. He looked at Cairo, then at the unwavering stillness of the man holding the footlocker, and he finally understood that he was not dealing with a hiker. He had miscalculated. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, his polite mask slipping back into place, though it was strained now. All right. Let's all just calm down." He took a slow step back. "This isn't over. You're making a very serious mistake." He and his men backed away slowly, their eyes locked on Cairo. They retreated into the trees the way they had come, their departure as quiet and sudden as their arrival. When they were gone, the silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It was charged, expectant. Elias reached down and laid a hand on Cairo's head. The dog relaxed his stance, the growl subsiding, but he remained alert, his gaze fixed on the woods where the men had disappeared. "Good boy," Elias whispered. He knew Caldwell was right about one thing. This wasn't over. He had uncovered the truth. Now he had to protect it. The thought didn't fill him with dread, as it once might have. It filled him with a cold, clear sense of purpose. He was no longer outrunning his ghosts. He was standing with them. Elias knew he had a limited window. Caldwell and his men would not simply give up. They would be back, and they would come with more than just polite threats. He moved quickly, with the decisive energy of a man whose mission parameters had just become crystal clear. He took the 2 remaining footlockers from the mine and concealed them carefully in a deep fissure in the rocks 100 yards away, covering the spot with brush and deadfall. One was enough to carry. The others were his insurance. Then, he used his satellite phone,
a piece of gear he carried for emergencies and had never used. The signal was weak in the deep valley, but he found a spot on a high rock where he could get a connection. He called the one person he knew would understand the gravity of the situation. "County Clerk's Office, Margaret Finch speaking." Her voice was as crisp and official as it had been in her office.
"It's Elias Thorne," he said, his voice low and urgent.
"I went into the mine." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Alistair called me," she said, her tone shifting from professional to concerned. "He told me your theory. What did you find?" "He was right," Elias said. "They weren't mining silver. They were hiding a crime. I have the proof. My grandfather's logs. He was the geologist. They silenced him and buried his work." He took a breath. "And someone else knows. A company called Apex Minerals. Their project manager, a man named Caldwell, just paid me a visit. He knows what's in here. He wants it buried for good." He could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end. He heard the rustle of papers, the click of a keyboard.
Margaret Finch was a woman of action.
"Apex Minerals," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They've been sniffing around for months, pushing for permits, citing economic development. I knew there was something off about them." She paused. "Where are you now?" "I'm still at the site. I can't leave it." "Don't," she said, her voice firm, commanding. "Stay put. I'm making some calls. The State Environmental Protection Agency, the sheriff. This is bigger than a county records issue now. This is a crime scene. But it will take me time to get the right people mobilized, especially with what's coming." "What's coming?" Elias asked. "A storm," she said. "A big one. The Weather Service just issued a severe warning for the whole range. High winds, torrential rain. It's going to make travel treacherous. Just be careful, Mr. Thorne, and stay on this line if you can." The call ended, and Elias was left with the echoing silence of the mountain. He looked up at the sky.
The brilliant blue of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a bruised, slate-gray ceiling that was descending rapidly. The wind was picking up, its voice changing from a whisper to a mournful howl as it tore through the high pines. The temperature was dropping. The storm was coming, an external manifestation of the conflict that was about to unfold. He spent the next hour preparing. He moved his truck to a more sheltered position. He reinforced his camp. He ate a cold meal, his movements economical, his mind focused. He sat with Cairo by the mine entrance, the footlocker resting between them. The dog sensed the change in the atmosphere, both meteorological and emotional. He lay with his head on his paws, but his eyes were open, watchful, fixed on the path where Caldwell had disappeared. The first fat drops of rain began to fall just as dusk gave way to a premature, stormy darkness. They were sporadic at first, splattering against the rock face with loud, wet smacks. Then the deluge began. The heavens opened, and the solid sheet of water slammed into the valley. The wind roared, turning the rain into a horizontal blast that stung his face. The world dissolved into a churning chaos of water and sound. It was through this chaos that the headlights appeared. 2 sets of them, powerful beams cutting through the downpour, bouncing and jostling as they navigated the rough terrain. They weren't from a standard truck. The sound that followed confirmed it. The heavy, grinding clank and diesel roar of heavy machinery. A small bulldozer, its yellow paint stark against the stormy gloom, lumbered into the clearing, its treads churning the forest floor into a muddy soup. Following it was a large utility truck, the one Caldwell had been in before. Caldwell himself got out of the passenger side, this time wearing a heavy-duty rain slicker. He was no longer smiling. His face was a mask of grim determination. His 2 men got out with him,
along with a third who climbed into the cab of the bulldozer. They had come to finish the job. Not with lawyers, but with brute force. They were going to use the storm as cover to erase the mine from the face of the earth, burying Elias and his evidence along with it if they had to. Elias stood up. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood in front of the mine entrance, a solitary, defiant figure against the rock. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead and streamed down his face. Cairo stood beside him, a dark, silent shadow, seemingly impervious to the storm's fury. Caldwell shouted to be heard over the wind and the rain. "Last chance, Thorne. Get out of the way. This is a reclamation project, and you are interfering." Elias didn't move. He just stared back, his silence a more powerful answer than any shout could be. Frustrated, Caldwell waved a hand at the man in the bulldozer. "Do it! Seal it up!" The bulldozer's engine roared to life, its powerful lights pinning Elias in their glare. It began to move forward, its massive blade lowered, ready to shove tons of rock and earth against the entrance. This was the standoff. Not in a dusty street at high noon, but in a forgotten valley in the heart of a raging storm. A man of conscience against a machine of expediency. Caldwell, seeing Elias's refusal to yield, made another gesture to one of his men, pointing up the steep, unstable slope above the mine entrance. It was a place littered with loose rock and old, rotting timbers from the original construction. The man scrambled up the muddy slope. It was a calculated, vicious move. He wasn't trying to kill Elias, not directly. He was trying to force him to move, to create a diversion, an accident that would be lost in the chaos of the storm. The man reached a large, precariously balanced pile of debris. He put his shoulder to a heavy, waterlogged beam. With a great heave, he sent it tumbling. It was the first domino. The beam crashed into a section of loose scree, and the entire slope gave way. A terrifying wave of rock, mud, and splintered timber cascaded down toward the mine entrance. Elias saw it coming. His training kicked in, his mind processing the trajectory in an instant. He was clear. The main force of the slide would hit to the left of where he was standing. He braced himself. But Cairo had also reacted. As the slide began, the dog, in a pure protective instinct, had moved to place his own body in front of Elias's, to shield him. It was a fatal miscalculation. A heavy, dark shape, one of the old, thick support timbers, cartwheeled through the air and slammed down across the dog's hindquarters, pinning his leg to the ground with a sickening crunch of bone. Cairo let out a sharp, piercing cry of agony that cut through the roar of the storm. He collapsed, his back half crushed under the weight of the beam, his trapped leg twisted at an unnatural angle. And in that instant, Elias's world shattered. The standoff, the mine, the evidence, it all vanished. All that existed was the sound of his partner's pain. His mind flashed back, an unwanted, searing memory. The dust and the shouting in a sun-blasted Afghan valley. A teammate, pinned down by enemy fire, his leg shattered. The call had come over the radio. "Exfil is hot. We have to move now. Leave him." And he, the team leader, had made the call. The mission over the man. He had given the order to fall back, to leave a brother behind to be captured or killed. He had lived with the ghost of that choice every single day since. He looked at Cairo, struggling and whimpering in the mud, and he saw the face of the man he had left behind. He saw the same impossible choice laid before him again. The evidence, the footlocker with his grandfather's journal, was right there. The bulldozer was advancing. He could protect the mission. He could secure the truth. Or he could go to his partner. There was no choice. Not this time. Without a second of hesitation, Elias abandoned his post. He scrambled over the shifting rubble of the landslide, ignoring the danger of further collapse. He dropped to his knees in the mud beside Cairo. "I'm here, boy," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I'm here. I've got you." He put his hands on the heavy beam. It was immense, waterlogged, and impossibly heavy. He set his feet, the muscles in his back and legs screaming as he lifted. He was choosing loyalty. He was choosing to stay. In that moment, sealing the mine or saving the evidence held no meaning. All that mattered was the life of the creature who had trusted him completely. Caldwell saw it all. He saw Elias abandon the entrance, saw him kneeling in the mud, vulnerable, his attention completely focused on the injured dog.
This was his chance. "Now!" he screamed at the bulldozer operator. "Push! Close it now!" The machine lurched forward again, its blade just yards from the entrance. The crime was about to be buried forever. But then, something happened. The bulldozer's engine sputtered, coughed, and died. A profound silence fell where its roar had been, leaving only the sound of the storm. In the cab of the machine sat the third man Caldwell had brought, a younger man named Davis. He had been watching the entire scene, his face pale. He had seen Elias's desperate, selfless act. Davis was a veteran himself, an infantryman who had done 2 tours. He recognized the look in Elias's eyes. He recognized the bond between the man and the dog. And when Caldwell gave the order to bury them, something inside him broke. He had accidentally hit the emergency fuel shutoff valve. He fumbled with the controls, pretending to try and restart it. "I don't know what happened," he yelled over the wind. "It's dead." It was a small act of defiance, a quiet mutiny born of a shared code that Caldwell would never understand. And in that crucial, stalled moment, 2 pairs of headlights sliced through the rain from the other end of the valley. A sheriff's department SUV and a state vehicle, their lights flashing, came sliding to a halt in the mud. Margaret Finch got out of the passenger side of the sheriff's truck, her face a mask of cold fury. A burly, uniformed sheriff stepped out of the driver's side, his hand resting on his sidearm. From the other vehicle, a woman in the official jacket of the Environmental Protection Agency emerged, her eyes taking in the bulldozer, the landslide, and the man kneeling over his injured dog. The tide had turned. Caldwell stared, his face ashen. His plan, his career, his carefully constructed world of lies, it was all unraveling in the Idaho mud. The truth, as Elias's grandfather had hoped, had finally found its way to the light, brought forth by a loyal dog, a haunted man, and the simple, courageous act of choosing to stay. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The sky was scrubbed clean, a pale, fragile blue. The air smelled of wet earth and washed pine. The valley, which had been a theater of chaos, was now still, holding its breath in the cool dawn light. The scene was transformed. The menacing bulldozer sat silent and abandoned. Caldwell's utility truck was gone, as were he and his men, now replaced by the official vehicles of the Kootenai County Sheriff's Department and the state EPA. Yellow caution tape, stark against the green and brown of the forest, cordoned off the entire area around the mine entrance. The site was no longer a secret. It was a protected crime scene. Elias sat on the tailgate of his own truck, a tin mug of steaming coffee cradled in his hands. He watched as a team of state officials, led by the serious woman from the EPA, began the meticulous work of documenting the site. They moved with a quiet reverence, photographers capturing every detail, a geologist taking samples from the landslide. The truth was being handled with care now, treated not as an inconvenience, but as something precious. In the passenger seat of his truck, the door open, lay Cairo. A local veterinarian, roused from his bed in the middle of the night by a commanding call from Margaret Finch, had met them on the road out of the valley.
The dog's rear leg was now encased in a heavy-duty splint and clean white bandages. He had been given something for the pain and was sleeping, though his breathing was shallow and his ear would twitch at any sudden sound. Elias had not left his side.
Sheriff Brody, a large, calm man who seemed unimpressed by corporate bluster, walked over to Elias. He handed him a statement to sign. "Caldwell and his crew are in custody," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They're trying to spin a story about emergency reclamation, but the kid who was driving the dozer, Davis, he's talking. Said they were ordered to seal the mine no matter what. Said he saw what they did to your dog." Elias nodded, signing the paper. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but underneath it, something else. A quiet, unfamiliar lightness. The weight he had been carrying for years felt different. Not gone, but shifted. "And Caldwell?" Elias asked. "He'll be tied up in legal trouble for years," the sheriff said. "Attempted destruction of evidence, reckless endangerment, a dozen environmental violations. Margaret is making sure the state throws the book at Apex Minerals. Your grandfather's journal is now official evidence. You did a good thing here, son." Elias just nodded again, unable to find the words. He watched the officials bring the other 2 footlockers out of the rock fissure where he had hidden them. The full scope of his grandfather's legacy was now safe. He was staring into the woods, lost in thought, when a car he didn't recognize pulled up behind the sheriff's vehicle. It was a simple sedan, dusty from the back roads. A woman got out. She was younger than him, with the same dark hair and a familiar, determined set to her jaw. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in almost 2 years. He hadn't answered her calls, her letters. He had wrapped himself in his silence and pushed away the one person who had tried to anchor him to the world. He felt a pang of shame. She walked toward him, her steps hesitant at first, then more certain. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes taking in his weary face, the sleeping dog in the truck, the official activity all around them. She looked at the mine entrance, then back at him. "Margaret Finch called me," she said, her voice soft. She told me everything." Elias didn't know what to say. "I should have called." Sarah shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "No, you had to come here first." Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. "All those years, we thought Grandpa just left. Dad died thinking his own father abandoned him." She took a breath. "You found him, Elias. You brought him home." She stepped forward and put a hand on his arm. Her touch was a jolt, a connection to a life he had tried to leave behind. He didn't pull away. "She said you had a choice," Sarah whispered, her gaze flicking to Cairo. "To protect the evidence or to help him. She said you didn't hesitate." She looked him straight in the eye, and he knew she wasn't just talking about the dog or the mine. "You stayed," she said. The 2 words landed with the weight of a benediction. You stayed. It was the absolution he had never known he was seeking. He hadn't run. He hadn't chosen the mission over his partner. He had broken the cycle of his own past. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the truck's window. He saw the same tired, haunted face, but the man looking back was different. The hollowness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet sorrow, but also by a flicker of something new. Resolve. Peace. He met his own gaze and, for the first time in years, he did not look away. He held it until his sister's hand squeezed his arm, pulling him back to the present. Later that day, Elias sat in a chair at the vet's office while Cairo was being examined again. He took a small leather-bound notebook from his jacket pocket, the one he carried but rarely wrote in. He opened it to a fresh page. He thought for a long time, then wrote a single sentence.
The water carries the legacy. He wasn't just thinking of the poison. He was thinking of the truth. He was thinking of the way things, if given enough time, eventually find their way to the light. A few weeks later, the story of the Widow's Tear mine was front-page news across the state. The tale of the corporate cover-up, the brave geologist, and the haunted veteran who brought it all to light had captured the public's imagination. Apex Minerals was facing a mountain of lawsuits and federal investigations. The valley was declared a state and federal environmental protection site, and a massive long-term project to clean the watershed was already being planned. The secret was not only out, it was being healed. Elias did not leave the mountains. The silence he had sought was still there, but it no longer felt like an escape. It felt like home. He bought a small plot of land not far from Clark's Fork, a quiet place with a view of the mountains that held his family's history. He had accepted an offer from Sheriff Brody to join the county's volunteer search and rescue team. His skills, honed in the deadliest places on Earth, would now be used to find the lost, to help the stranded, to bring people home. It was a new mission, one of restoration, not destruction. His sister visited on weekends, and together they began the slow work of rebuilding the family bond he had tried to sever. 3 months after the storm, Elias stood on a ridge overlooking the valley of the Widow's Tear mine. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Beside him stood Cairo. The dog's leg had healed, leaving him with a slight, dignified limp. A shared scar, a physical reminder of the choice that had redefined them both. He no longer stood with that constant, coiled tension. His body was relaxed, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. He leaned against Elias's leg, a simple, profound gesture of companionship. Elias looked down at the valley. The yellow caution tape was gone, replaced by a simple, permanent fence and a new sign. This one was carved from solid cedar, its letters deep and clear. It designated the area as a historical landmark and an ecological recovery zone. It told the story of the mine, of the poison, and of the geologist who tried to tell the truth. It named him Dr. Eris Thorne. His grandfather's name was no longer a ghost. It was a landmark. Elias felt a sense of peace settle over him, as vast and quiet as the mountains themselves. He had not outrun his memories here. Instead, he had confronted them, not by fighting, but by choosing to care. He had found that the antidote to the poison of the past was not forgetting, but loyalty. It was the simple, powerful act of choosing to stay. He reached down and rested his hand on Cairo's head, and together, man and dog stood in the quiet sunlight, 2 veterans who had finally, truly, come home.